كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Beloved students, hope you guys are doing very well. We are starting level, or rather lesson 9 today, still on Kitab Sir, regarding the expeditions of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, jihad in the path of Allah, combat and international relations. So today we're going to move on to the discussion regarding their slaves. So if some of their slaves want to join us, then what? Then there's also the fact that once we go in there, what are we allowed to consume and not consume? For example, if the Muslim army goes there, are they allowed to graze their animals from the local resource, from the local grass and so on? And likewise, whatever in the modern context that would be. And so what is allowed in there, what is not allowed there, even though it hasn't been distributed yet, because remember, anything that you get from the enemy land is usually called the booty, which means the spoils of war, and the imam has to decide how to divide that. So this is before division, you're still in the process of moving ahead. So what do you do in that case? So there's all laws related to that. And then there's the discussion about Islam al-Kafir fi dar al-harbi qabla asrihi. If a non-Muslim in a dar al-harb is to become a Muslim before he is taken a prisoner, how do you deal with them, and so on. And then there's the discussion regarding the impermissibility of selling weapons to the people that you're at war with. That's not permissible, obviously, because then they'll use it against Muslims. So that's a very interesting topic as well. So let us start off from page 257 of the Baghdad edition of the Lubab. So لحوق عبيد الكفار بالمسلمين. This is where the non-Muslim slaves want to join up with the Muslims. وإذا خرج عبيدهم إلى عسكر المسلمين فهو أحرار. If their slaves, non-Muslim slaves, are to come out and join up with the Muslim forces, then they become automatically freed. So they become automatically manumitted. They no longer will be considered slaves, because they have managed to secure themselves by coming out from their abode, from their slavery, and they've managed to escape their masters. So that's completely fine. They can do that. So then he also says, likewise, if they were just to become Muslims, without joining us, they were to become Muslims, they did not join up with the Muslim army, but they did become Muslim. And then we managed to overcome their lands and take it over, then they also become manumitted. They also become free. So this is some ways where slaves are given freedom. Also, another interesting thing, is a side issue, but what's interesting is that usually the wala, the clientage, and the benefits of that, like inheritance, so on, are received by those who free slaves, because they don't usually have families. So it's their manumitter, their master who freed them, who gets the benefits if they die and so on, before the master, obviously. In this case, though, because they've become Muslim already, they didn't join with us, they become Muslim, or in any of these cases where they become free automatically, this is considered a legal manumission, which is not done by anybody in particular, but by the Muslim, but by the ruling. So nobody gets their clientage in that sense, and nobody becomes their mawla as such. They become just completely free. They have a different hukum. Right. Then he moves on to say that what are you allowed to gather there? What are you allowed to forage there? What are you allowed to take from there, from a Darul Harb? Before this is in the process of the war. This isn't when you've already taken over. When it's taken over, then it's up to the Hakim how he wants to administrate everything and in whose authority he wants to put it into. But this is a case where you're still on the course. So what happens then? وَلَا بَأْسَ بِأَنْ يَعْلِفَ الْعَسْكَرُ فِي دَارِ الْحَرْبِ دَوَابَهُمْ. So if obviously the Muslim army have gone with all of their animals, their horses and camels or any other supply animals, they need to feed somewhere. They don't have to carry food with them. They can actually allow them to eat the hay, the grass, and any other food that's there. وَيَأْكُلُوا مَا وَجَدُوا مِنَ الطَّعَامِ, and they're also allowed to eat whatever food that they get there, like the bread, and this is the army itself. They're allowed to, so they also allow themselves to eat the food that they find there, like the bread and the meat and the oil and anything else that they get access to. Zahidi says that obviously this is only based on haja and need, right? Now, if you don't need it and you're still going to take from there and eat from there, just extra, then there's two opinions regarding that. So one is that you can, the other one is that you can't. You can also use their firewood, so you can use their fuel. For example, today that would translate into fuel. You can use their fuel, and you can use their oil. If there's a need for that, you can use their oil and so on. So their fuel, their petrol, their diesel, their gas, as the Americans would say, and so on. And you can also, obviously, if you capture any of their weapons, you can obviously use them to, in your battle as well. كُلُّ ذَلِكَ بِغَيْرِ قِسْمَةٍ. This was the important part. This is all before any official distribution and division by the Hakim, that which would be obviously after the case, after everything has been taken under control. This is in the process. So you can use this because it's based on need. So whatever the need is, they can do that. يعني إذا احتاج إليه, if there's a need for it. For example, if somebody's weapons were broken, malfunctioned, so they're talking about swords and spears and arrows and so on. Nowadays it'd be your guns and your tanks and so on. You could obviously use that, especially if it's superior or whatever the case is. Likewise, if you need their armored cars, or in today's parlance, armored cars, or if you need their vehicles to travel around, their helicopters, planes, and you get it, then there's nothing wrong in using those for the sake of the war, even before the distribution. فَإِذَا زَالَتِ الْحَاجَةِ, but once you've used them, you can't keep them for yourself. You have to return them back into the spoils of war, into the general spoils, so that they can then be divided by the Hakim for whoever it's deserving of it. And that will be discussed later, of how that's distributed. Now he's saying here that لا ينبغي أن يستعمل من الدواب والثياب والسلاح شيئا لتبقى به ولتبقى به دابته وثيابه وسلاحه لأنه من الغلول لاستعماله من غير حاجة وتمامه في الجوهرة. So what he's discussing here is that it's not appropriate to use any of their vehicles or animals or their clothing, or even their weapons, just to preserve yours. So you stop using yours and you just use theirs so that yours don't get wasted, right? Because that's not a need. That means you should be using your own. This will actually be considered misappropriation, and misappropriation in the general, because that's considered general property of the Muslimin, once they overcome it. So that is considered ghulul, and ghulul has a huge warning around it. So it's considered misappropriation, because a person is using something without need, and so one should avoid that. Then he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ أَن يَبِيعُوا مِنْ ذَلِكَ الطَّعَامِ وَنَحْوِهِ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَتَمَوَّلُوهُ لِأَنَّهُ لَمْ يُمْلَكْ بِالْأَخْذِ. Now remember, the only reason that you're allowed to do this is just to allow you to continue and to sustain yourself. So none of that becomes your ownership. You're only allowed to take as much as is needed and to then use it. Of course, if it's food or something, then you're allowed to consume it. You're not going to return that, obviously. But anything else, you have to return it. You can't just keep it, because these things don't become owned. The ownership does not become established by just taking them. It's only allowed to use them for the need, right? So that's why people aren't allowed to sell any of this. You can't take it and then just sell it to somebody, because it's not yours to sell. It's just yours to use unless it's given to you in a division afterwards. If somebody does have to sell something or does sell something, they'll have to put the money back into the national the national treasury as such, or the collective amassed wealth. Islam al-Kafir fi dar al-harbi qabla asrihi. Now it moves on to a discussion about the non-Muslims themselves becoming a Muslim before they're imprisoned, or before they're taken as prisoners. So they become Muslim. Now what? That creates a whole different scenario. وَمَنْ أَسْلَمَ مِنْهُمْ فِي دَارِ الْحَرْبِ قَبْلَ أَخْذِهِ. Whoever, before being captured, becomes a Muslim in the Dar al-Harb, in this abode of war, أَحْرَزَ بِإِسْلَامِهِ نَفْسَهُ. By the Islam that he has accepted, he has secured himself. He has preserved himself and protected himself. Nobody can touch him now. لأن الإسلام ينافي ابتداء الاسترقاق. Because being a Muslim will prevent somebody from becoming a slave. So you can't make such a person a slave. You can make prisoners of war slaves if they're non-Muslim, right? That is one option. But if they're Muslim, you can't make them slaves. That's out of the that's not an option anymore. وَأَوْلَادَهُ الصِّغَارِ. And likewise, any of their younger minor children, they're also not allowed to become slaves because they are considered subordinate to their parents in their Islam as well. So if the parents have become Muslim, that means the children will also be dealt with as Muslims. وَكُلُّ مَالٍ هُوَ فِي يَدِهِ لِسَبْقِهَا إِلَيْهِ. And also any wealth that they possess will also be protected because they've become Muslim. It's their wealth. It remains theirs. أو وديعة في يد معصوم الدم مسلم أو وديعة في يد معصوم الدم مسلم أو ذمي لأنه في يد صحيحة محترمة ويده كيده. Or likewise, if they've got any assets that are in the possession, that are not in the possession, but that, in the possession, they're being looked after by somebody, a Muslim or a dhimmi, then that would be protected as well because it's being looked after by somebody who is considered to be sanctified and inviolable, essentially. فإن ظهرنا على الدار فعقاره فيء لأنه في يد أهل الدار إذ هو من جملة دار الحرب فلم يكن في يده حقيقة. However, if we are to conquer their lands, then he says that their lands will become the Muslim lands. Because this is probably a very specific scenario where they have maybe become Muslim and come towards us, but their land has been taken over or is in control of the disbelievers. So when the Muslims will overcome that area, that will become the Muslim land, right? It won't remain theirs. So that's a very specific ruling. وَكَذَا زَوْجَتُهُ فَيْءٌ لأنها كافرة حربية. Now let's just say a guy became Muslim, but the husband became Muslim, the wife did not become Muslim. Then she will not be treated in the same way. The wife doesn't get security because of the husband. The young minor children do, but nobody else. So he says وَكَذَا زَوْجَتُهُ فَيْءٌ. So his zawja, she will also become spoils of war لأنها كافرة حربية, because the assumption is that she is a disbeliever and a person of war. لا تتبعه في الإسلام. If he became Muslim, she remaining non-Muslim will not be subordinate to him. وكذا حملها فيء لأنه جزء منه فيتبعها في الرق والحرية وإن كان تبعا للأب في الإسلام لأن المسلم محل التملك تبعا لغيره. Likewise, if she's pregnant, right, and she's carrying a fetus, that fetus with her, because it's a part of her, will also be treated the same as her and not like a husband, right? Even though it will be treated as a Muslim, though, right? Yes, unless it's a what do you call it, a separate child, which we've already discussed. وَكَذَا أَوْلَادُهُ الْكِبَارُ فَيْءٌ. His older, mature children, they will also be treated as just independent individuals who are not Muslim, so they'll just be dealt with just like anybody else, right? They don't have dependency with the father, so they are not going to be treated the same way as the father. So they will have to become Muslim themselves for them to be under a different command. حرمة بيع السلاح ونحوه لأهل الحرب. Now we're moving on to the next section, which is regarding selling weapons to the non-Muslim lands. Are we allowed to do that? ولا ينبغي بل يحرم كما في الزيل أن يباع السلاح والكراع من أهل الحرب لما فيه من تقويتهم على قتال المسلمين وكذا كل ما فيه تقوية لهم كالحديد والعبيد ونحو ذلك. It is completely inappropriate. In fact, he then clarifies, Maidani does, that it's haram to that any kind of weapons are sold, not just weapons, but any kind of vehicles, because in those days it was qura', which meant horses. So horses would today mean, it doesn't mean weapons only, but it also refers to any kind of vehicles used in war, any kind of machinery, vehicles, what do you call it, aeroplanes, helicopters, all of those things would be haram to sell to the people, to the abode of war, because of what it entails of strengthening them upon fighting against the Muslimin. Likewise, to sell them anything that would strengthen their position against the Muslimin, like ore, like metal, like iron, right? Or slaves for that matter, or anything else, any kind of supplies, that would be haram. ولا يجهز أي يتاجر بذلك إليهم. You're not allowed to trade with them. You're not allowed to do that trade thinking that, oh, this is a wonderful time to make lots of money, right? Because obviously people are in need. Countries, whenever they're at war, the people who make weapons, they're the ones who are laughing all the way, right? Because that's the market. That becomes their market to sell things to, and they need them on a daily basis. So you're not allowed to do trade with that. So حكم الفداء بالأسرى. Now it jumps on to another topic, which is, can you take a ransom and free the slaves that you might take? Now again, whether people are made slaves or not today, that would be a whole different discussion, and it would be at the discretion of the leader of the Muslimin. From what I've understood of the recent cases in Afghanistan and other places, they never did this, right? And but again, I'm just reading what was the standard thing to do in those days. وَلَا يُفَادُونَ بِالْأُسَارَى عِنْدَ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ. That they should not ransom, they should not any of the, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, anybody taken as prisoner should not be ransomed, right? They should not be ransomed. لأن فيه معونة الكفرة, because in there what you're doing is you're giving them back, and that means the prisoners of war, right? That means you're giving them back, and then you're just assisting them, right, in that regard. لأنه يعود حربا علينا, because they're just going to come back and fight against us. ودفع الشر حرابه خير من استنقاذ الأسير المسلم. So he's saying that repelling any harm of him potentially fighting you back is superior to swapping them for Muslim prisoners, right? Because this is an interesting point, and again, this has to be contextualized, and this would differ based on situations, right? So he's saying that because if the Muslim prisoners stay in their hands, then yes, that would be a test on their part, but that would not be something that would be attributed to us. And whereas if we were to give them their prisoners back in this particular scenario, then that would be assisting them in that regard. And again, this is a particular a take on this by Imam Abu Hanifa. For that time, it seems today it would be under discretion of whoever the leader is to decide what's the best option today. وقال, the Sahibain, they have a different opinion. يُفَادَ بِهِمْ أُسَارَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. They have no problem with ransoming them. So to give back the prisoners for a ransom, to pay a ransom and give back. Well, actually, not by payment, but by exchanging prisoners. So لأن فيه تخليص المسلم, because it says the benefit there is that you're releasing Muslims for the release of the non-Muslim prisoners. وهو أولى من قتل الكافر, and he reckons that they reckon that that's a better option than just killing the kafirs, and that it's the end of story. You'd rather use them to get back your prisoners and to benefit from that. So they're looking at it in that sense, whereas Imam Abu Hanifa saw it in a different sense. But again, their situation, the time they were in, the supremacy of the Muslim Ummah, etc., all of that is taken into consideration. Isbi Jabi, one of the jurists, he says the Sahih opinion is Imam Abu Hanifa's. Imam Mahbubi and Nasafi and others have also relied on that opinion. But Zahidi says that while Imam Zahidi, who is the author of Al-Jawharatun Nayyara, he says that to take monetary ransom, right, rather than prisoner exchange, that is not permitted according to the Zahir al-Madhab, according to the apparent understanding we get from our Madhab. In the Siyar al-Kabir, it says that there's nothing wrong with that either. As-Siyar al-Kabir, Imam Muhammad's book, there's nothing wrong with that. If the Muslims need that, then that is allowed as well. Just because we take evidence and proof of that from the prisoners of Badr, where the Prophet ﷺ ransomed them for money, right, for payment. Okay, what happens if one of their non-Muslim prisoners becomes Muslim while they're in our control? لا يفادى بمسلم أسير في أيديهم. Then that person cannot be given back to them in exchange for even a Muslim, because it's like exchanging Muslim for Muslim. What's the point of that? لا يفيد. There's no benefit in that, unless he wants to go back for whatever reason, and he wants to do that, and as long as he's a person whose Islam can now be is settled enough and strong enough to be trusted, that he won't go back there and this is not a ploy or something. Then he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ الْمَنُّ عَلَيْهِمْ. It is not permitted to just free them for free, which means out of a favor, just favor them and let them go. لِمَا فِيهِ مِنْ إِطَّالِ حَقِّ الْغَانِمِينَ. Interesting reason, he said, because what you're then doing is you're squandering the opportunity and the right of the forces who actually fought there. This is going to be, this is something that they should be getting to benefit themselves, and if you're just letting them go for free, then it means that you're burning these people's right. Okay, now it moves on to the next discussion, is that if a place has been taken by force and Muslims are dominant, what do you do now? What's the procedure? وَإِذَا فَتَحَ الْإِمَامُ بَلْدَةً عَنْوَةً أي قَهْرًا. So if a place is taken over by force, not by a peace treaty, not by them just submitting, right, but rather by aggression, by force, and they were overcome, فَهُوَ فِي الْعَقَارِ بِالْخِيَارِ بَيْنَ أَمْرَيْنِ. Now all the lands there are two options. He's got two options. The Muslim leader has two options with regards to the land. إِنْ شَاءَ قَسَمَهُ بَيْنَ الْغَانِمِينَ. He can actually divide that among the people who are deserving of that, of those spoils, which are the fighters, the people in combat. He can give it to them, okay, this is yours and that's yours. كما فعل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بخيبر. The Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم did this, exactly this, in Khaybar, that all of those who went to fight there, he distributed among them. وَإِنْ شَاءَ أَقَرَّ أَهْلَهُ عَلَيْهِ. The other option is that no, he keeps the people who own that land upon it, and it keeps it in their ownership. وَوَضَعَ عَلَيْهِمْ الْخَرَاجِ. But then puts a land tax on there, they call it a tith, right? A land tax on there, so he allows them to remain, but then they have to pay a certain percentage every year from their crops. كما فعل عمر رضي الله عنه بالسواد العراق بموافقة الصحابة رضوان الله عليهم أجمعين. This is exactly what Umar رضي الله عنه did in the fertile lands of Iraq, right? And this was done in conformance or in agreement with the other Sahaba who were present. So we have both of these models to follow, both of these options to follow, so they can do either, so the Amir has the right to do that. Now regarding that opinion, they're saying Al-Awla huwa al-awwal 'inda hajati al-ghanimin. The first opinion is the better opinion, superior opinion, if the people who fought there and who won, if they've got a need, then it's better to give it among them. And if they don't have and they got lots of other stuff, then do the kharaj, because that will be an ongoing benefit to the Muslim, to Muslim treasury, right? قيدنا بالعقار لأن المنقول لا يجوز المن فيه بالرد عليهم. Now we qualified this with being land and estate, because anything that is movable, any movable articles, that can't be given back to them. That is, there's no permissibility of giving that back to them for free, right? They can buy it or whatever the situation is. Now what does an imam do? Now this is interesting. What does an imam do with the prisoners? those that they've taken as prisoners of war, what do they do with them? وهو أي الإمام في الأسرى بالخيار بين ثلاثة أمور. The leader of the Muslims, he has three options here, right? In terms of what they do with the prisoners. And remember, I'm reading the fiqh to you, right? How this exactly applies in battle today, I don't know, right? I've never had an opportunity to figure this out in real life, right? So this is technically what is going on here, right? How it applies, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Where I can mention parallels, I will do, right? But I've never been, unfortunately, in that situation to see how this is going to work out. So وهو الإمام في الأسرى بالخيار إن شاء قتلهم حسما لماذا الفساد. So in the first option is that he can actually kill them and he can finish them off just to basically uproot the whole problem. These are for the prisoners of war. The second option is istarakahum, which means to make them take them as slaves, and there's a benefit in doing that. He says, وَإِنْ شَاءَ تَرَكَهُمْ أَحْرَارًا ذِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. The third option is that you can leave them as free beings, right? But under the authority of the Muslims, if they are people of dhimma, right? If they're willing to pay the dhimma and so on. This is what, as I said, Umar radiallahu anhu did. In many cases, Umar radiallahu anhu did this in the fertile lands of Iraq, where he just left the people and he let them carry on, and they just became dhimmis, right? Now again, all of this will depend on the circumstance and the situation at that time. Now this obviously says, he says that we qualify this as long as they're people of dhimma. So if they are murtaddeen, if they're apostates, they don't get this third option at all. Or the mushrikeen of the Arabs, they're not allowed to become Ahlul Dhimma, which we discussed earlier anyway, right? They only have an option to become Muslim, or otherwise they're just dealt with of the Arabs, the mushrikeen of the Arabs, because they should know better, they know the language and so on. So if they're still pagans, that's an issue. Christians and Jews would have the more lenient approach. ولا يجوز الإمام أن يردهم إلى دار الحرب لما فيه من تقوية مع المسلمين كما مر. Likewise, it's not permissible to return any of these prisoners back to the Darul Harb, because then they're just gonna go and do the same thing again. Okay, now so this is obviously about prisoners of war. This isn't about the whole population. This is about the prisoners of war. Because you're not even allowed to touch people who are innocent. You're not even allowed to touch people who are not fighting with you, like they said, the women and the old people and so on. So how are you going to take them prisoner if that's the case? These are the actual prisoners of war. So these are the people who were fighting against you. These are the three options for that. Now, ما يفعله الإمام بالمواشي التي غنمها ولم يستطع نقلها. What happens when you've been able to capture a lot of cattle, a lot of vehicles, you could say nowadays, a lot of vehicles, right? A lot of machinery in that sense. But you're not able to take them back. What do you do now? Do you just leave them there for them to use? وَإِذَا أَرَادَ الْإِمَامُ الْعَوْدَ إِلَى دَارِ الْإِسْلَامِ. So this is in the case where the Imam wants to go back to the Darul Islam. وَمَعَهُ مَوَاشٍ. And he's got all of, this cattle and everything. فَلَمْ يَقْدِرْ عَلَى نَقْلِهَا إِلَى دَارِ الْإِسْلَامِ. And he can't take all of these vehicles back. ذَبَحَهَا. Now in this case, he will destroy them. So in the case of animals, he will slaughter them. وَبَعْدَهُ حَرَقَهَا. And then he will burn them. So in the same case, that if you can't take it back, you can't make use of it, you don't want to leave it there for them to use against you, so then you can destroy them. لأن ذبح الحيوان يجوز لغرض صحيح, because it's permissible to slaughter animals for a valid reason. ولا غرض أصح من كسر شوكة أعداء الله. And there is no objective that is more right and more correct to do than to destroy the shawka, which means to destroy the how do you say shawka? To destroy the pride of the disbelievers or the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا يَعْقِرُهَا. What you are not allowed to do is that you can't just mutilate them by cutting off their keeping them alive and cutting off their limbs and things like that, and then leaving them alive. You're not allowed to do that, because that's persecution for no reason. And likewise, you're not allowed to leave them there either. And again, this is specifically war animals. This isn't talking about general cows and goats that are used for food and things. No, this is talking about horses. So this is talking about weapons. This is talking about army vehicles. This isn't talking about just regular vehicles and so on. This isn't talking about regular animals. Okay, now he moves on to the discussion of the spoils of war are ready. Right, the spoils of war have all been gathered together. Where will you distribute them? Are you allowed to distribute them in the enemy lands, or do you have to take them back to the Muslim lands and then distribute them there among the fighters? So وَلَا يَقْسِمُ الْإِمَامُ غَنِيمَةً فِي دَارِ الْحَرْبِ. He's not allowed to divide. He's not allowed to divide it up in the enemy abode. بل حتى يخرجها إلى دار الإسلام. He has to first bring it out to the Muslim lands. لأن الملكة لا يثبت الغانمين إلا بالإحراز بدار الإسلام. Subhanallah, there's a technical reason here. The ownership cannot be established for the fighters, those who will receive entitled to it, until all of those spoils have been secured in the lands of Islam, because they could be attacked again in Darul Harb. It's not safe there. So the only way to say it's safe is when it's taken back, when it's carried back. Then it can be divided there and given to them. Now, how does he divide between them? So he says, وَالرِّدْءُ أي المعين والمقاتل في العسكر سواء لاستوائهم في السبب. The combatant, the one who was an actual fighter, and those who were supporting the supporting team, they are both eligible because they were both part of the war, they were both part of the victory. Yes, one was on the front lines, the other ones were providing the supplies and assistance, so they all considered to be equal in that regard. And what are they equal in? The fact that they participated. They went beyond the Muslim lands to enemy lands, put themselves into danger, and they participated in the battlefield. So they essentially exposed themselves. So that's why they all are going to get something. Likewise, if somebody went there but then wasn't able to fight because they fell sick or they fell ill or because of some other reason, they've gone there, they've ventured out there, they've put themselves out there, right? So they're all going to get something. How much they get, we'll discuss that later. Now the next section he discusses is, how does somebody help? How do you get assistance? So he says, وَإِذَا لَحِكَهُمْ الْمَدَدْ وَهُوَ مَا يُرْسَلُ إِلَى الْجَيْشِ لِيَزْدَادُوا. If reinforcements join up with them, which means that there was a contingent fighting there, but then more were needed. So the leader, the government sent out more forces to assist them, to increase their numbers. في دار الحرب قبل أن يخرجوا الغنيمة إلى دار الإسلام. And they got there, and mashallah, everything had already been taken. So they got there, so they exposed themselves out, they were sent there, but mashallah, everything was already done by the time they got there, right? So what happens then? But this was before the wealth was taken out, before all of the captured booty was taken out, and before it was split up, right? They would also become shareholders. They would also participate in that. Because, okay, they never got to fight, but they were willing to do so, so they will get that as well. And to conclude, I mean, that is probably one of the reasons why they're not allowed to divide any of the spoils of war within the Darul Harb, because especially in those days where you wouldn't know that your reinforcement is coming or they're on the way or so on. And they've actually left their families and everything to come to reinforce. So until they don't get back to Darul Islam and they find the reinforcements on the way or whatever it is, then everybody will be involved in that. That's why nobody's allowed to take it beforehand, so that it doesn't become, nobody's deprived in that sense. Okay, so now let's conclude today's lesson, which is, we dealt with a number of issues today, that they're not allowed to. Firstly, it was that if any of their slaves became Muslim and came out to join the Muslim army, they become free. They become free people. Then there is discussion about no harm on an ongoing process, as they're in enemy lands. There's nothing wrong with feeding your animals or giving fuel to your vehicles. Likewise, consuming any food that you find if you need it. So anything you need, you're allowed to take, but you're not allowed to become owner of it. You can just use it for need. That was the discussion. You're not allowed to sell any of that, because it doesn't become yours, because the spoils of war are only going to be divided later on. But whatever you need, because you have to fuel yourself, you have to eat, you have to nourish yourself, all of that is allowed. Then it said that any non-Muslim who becomes a Muslim, then before being taken a prisoner, then they become safe, and their younger minor children are also with them in that regard, but not their wife, nor their older children, and so on. Likewise, any of their owned items remains theirs, except the land that they have, which becomes the Muslims. And then the other prohibition that we discussed today was that it's not allowed for Muslims to sell either weapons or anything, or any war equipment, or likewise anything that would contribute in that regard to non-Muslims, because then it's just going to be used against Muslims. So that's not allowed. Then there was a difference of opinion between Imam Abu Hanifa and the Sahibain regarding exchanging prisoners. Imam Abu Hanifa didn't allow it. They can't change non-Muslim prisoners back for Muslim prisoners. Sahibain allowed it, right? And then there was a whole discussion there. And it's also saying that it's not permitted to just give prisoners up for free just like that either. And then the discussion was that if the Imam was to conquer a place by force, then he has a choice that all the captured goods, he can either split them, or the lands, he can actually split them among the fighters, or he can actually allow the previous owners to stay on them, but then they pay a special kharaj tax. And then the discussion was that yes, we have an example in this from before. And likewise, the Imam has those who were fighters and were taken as prisoners of war by the Muslims. The Imam has three possibilities: that he can either kill them, or he can make them slaves, or number three, he can actually free them and let them stay as residents and Ahlul Dhimma. We discussed that as well, but he can't let them go back, so they will have to stay in the Muslim lands afterwards. They, as prisoners of war, they were brought here. They think that you can leave them, then they'll have to stay in the Muslim lands. They can't be sent back to Darul Harb. And the Muslims leader is not allowed to divide the spoils of war in the Darul Harb itself. He has to take it back to Darul Islam, and then that's where they will divide it. And this also means that stuff that he can't take, which can be used against the Muslim, he can destroy down there in Darul Harb itself, right? And likewise, any reinforcements that reinforcers that come and supporters, they will also be they will also take part in the booty. So hopefully that explains everything, and that ends our 9th lesson. Inshallah, we'll see you in the 10th lesson. Inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.